I would love for the conversation to be more about how do we make sure that every single educator in America has the best technology at their disposal and the best understanding of how to use that technology at their disposal to be able to build human and durable skills for young folks. And then how do we make sure that young people in college, young people in high school are seeing that their education is technology enhanced and creative and interesting and like all of those things, and then want to be educators, right? Because they see that. They're not just sitting bored, feeling like school's irrelevant. I'm not interested in being here. I can't even have my phone, which I know is super relevant to the workplace and all these places. Why would I want to go be a teacher and be stuck in this situation for a very long time? And so without having that conversation about the talent, we also risk future talent into the education ecosystem, which I think is a threat, but also an opportunity if we get ahead of it enough.
So I'm here, aiEDU Studios episode, I think like in the 15s now.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's still very early, but...
Who else have you interviewed, Alex?
Also interviewed Kumar Garg from Renaissance Philanthropy, Roy Bahat, the head of Bloomberg Beta, which is like the first VC to really invest in future work.
Cool.
Gavin Purcell, he was Jimmy Fallon's showrunner. Lots of founders, lots of folks that are leading organizations.
Yeah.
Not necessarily AI organizations. Like our whole ethos is, we're trying to not necessarily be on the stage. We're trying to build a stage for organizations that have the trust and connectivity and I think ground game to actually reach the communities across the country that are integral to our mission. We're trying to reach all students. It's a very audacious goal. So we can't do it alone. And so it part of the whole thing about why do a podcast was, we were both just talking about having been to the ASU GSV Summit. I was on I think 4 panels. I was with some of the smartest people in our space. And it's a travesty to me that they each only got about 15 minutes to talk. And, you're sort of getting only to a certain surface level. And also, a live panel is not something that you can go back and edit. So you're a little more buttoned up. This is a bit more free form. You can speak freely. Well, we can go back and, make some tweaks if there's, if you put your foot in your mouth. But it allows us to so our goal really is, for folks who are following our work and wondering, what does the AI readiness movement look like? Shining a light on the Reinvention Lab, I think, is part of helping them to understand, not necessarily because the Reinvention Lab is an AI organization, although you might say it is. I don't really think of it as an AI organization. And yet, if we think about what is the hardest work to be done over the next 5 years, it's work that orgs like TFA are extremely well placed to do. How do you move like 13,000 school districts, 50 million kids, 100 million parents and guardians, 4 million teachers, 50 state departments of education, all of them fractured, not centralized. In some cases, it's not even centralized in the state. You're actually going district by district. And the challenges that come from that is also, I think, benefits to not being centralized, but the only way to reach a huge human system, maybe one of the biggest in history, right? This like very big set of people doing stuff, endeavoring in sort of one set, like a general goal of getting students ready for the future. The only way to do it is with orgs that have been walking the walk for. So how long have you been at Teach for America at the Reinvention Lab? Maybe you don't have to give us the whole journey, but for folks that aren't familiar with the Reinvention, where were you born?
I was born outside Chicago, Illinois. Moved to England for a few years and ended up in Cleveland, Ohio for most of my growing up. So go Cavs, shout out Shaker Heights. But yeah, the Reinvention Lab, I've been at Teach America for 5 years now, and I was the first employee of the lab that Michelle Culver hired. Michelle, who, shout out the Rhythm Project, is doing incredible work and thinking about human relationships in the age of AI. And she came in with a hunch, which is, Teach for America has been doing incredible work in systems change education for a really long time, making sure that more young folks are able to access possibility and opportunity in the way that the system was designed. And she kind of started to realize, like, what if the system actually is designed in a way that's not going to reach all of young folks? Or what if actually we need to totally reinvent and redesign what the system looks like and do both things at the same time? Make sure that the young folks that are going through the system right now, today, are getting the best possible outcomes they can in the current system. And also, how do we totally reinvent the system that fundamentally wasn't designed for the type of learning that actually makes us most human, especially in a world where AI is going to take over a lot of the rote tasks that our original education system was designed for. And so that's kind of the task of the Reinvention Lab and Teach for America, is both being able to improve the current system, get more young people access to opportunity and thriving right now, and also really do the work of reinventing the system for 2, 5, 10, 100 years from now. Well, I've talked about it a lot. Yeah. Did it make sense?
It's really good. Yeah, it's really good. So how long have you been at the Reinvention Lab?
It's been 5 years now.
Oh, where were you before?
Was that? Shout out Remake Learning in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I think Remake Learning is one of the most, well, I believe it is the most robust learning ecosystem for the future of learning anywhere in the country. 600 organizations. I worked with many school districts, about 100 school districts in southwestern Pennsylvania, but also museums, libraries, industry, philanthropy, government, higher ed. And my job was to network them all together and figure out how do they work in a cross-systems way to forward the future of learning for young folks in Pittsburgh and the surrounding area. And I often say my heart is, there are many pieces of my heart that are still in Pittsburgh. And if I hadn't fallen in love and needed to move to California, I would still be there. And as it happened, I met Michelle at the exact moment where I was considering a move out here, and she was starting the lab, and it all kind of came together in this really beautiful way that I feel grateful for all the time.
Yeah, and Michelle has that effect on people.
She sure does.
She is a visionary, but also someone that you just want to be in space with.
Yes.
And frankly, I think the type of work that she built and that you're now leading at Reinvention Lab it's really like right at the very epicenter of what has to get done. My guess is you're not building a tool you're like all on your own. Like that's not your core strategy. I don't want to assume that. Okay. It's funny because I was at ASU GSV, I would say 95% of the conversations, whether it was funders or organizations, it was like all about like, what are the tools that we're building? How are we going to use AI to do all this stuff? And to me, it rings quite hollow because it feels very much like, well, there's this big problem that we're not necessarily acknowledging, but we all know exists, which is that AI is going to like radically disrupt pathways to prosperity for kids. And I chafe a bit at the idea that AI is going to solve the problem that it created. And so if you then sort of ask, well, how do you solve that problem? And I think the answer is, how do you push a traditionally slow-moving, molasses-like institution, or really a gazillion institutions, and get them to evolve at a pace that is required, which I don't know that has ever necessarily happened. I was talking to Dr. Keisha King at T-Mobile. So she's like a longtime administrator in Houston, or outside of Houston, and then went to T-Mobile, was leading their sort of like broadband connectivity work. And so she was there at the beginning of, like online learning. And she was reflecting on, all the analogs that we're hearing where everybody was like, it's going to change education and it's going to do all this amazing stuff. And it was like, I just had this nagging feeling in the back of my head that like the internet's not going to replace teaching and learning. Like this is, sure, it's a support. And she was right, I would say. But I'm curious if there are any analogs that you in your career, I remember the first time I used, dial-up internet. But I wasn't quite in the education space. And so, yeah, like, is there, like, do you see any sort of like echoes of, past new technologies and the euphoria or the excitement or the concern that we're experiencing today with AI?
I mean, 100%. I was that girl who was building HTML websites about my favorite book series when I was really little. For those who are curious, it is Animorphs. So I've been interested in emerging technology for a long time, and ancestrally, like I feel an ancestral connection to education, right? My father was in community college work his whole career. And so I literally grew up in the halls of community colleges. That was his educational work, to think about like, how do all people in a community gain access to high quality education? And for him, it was through community colleges. And for me, so when I think about the connection between emerging technology and education, I often think about conversations I've had with him. I remember one time we were doing this big digital portfolio initiative in Pittsburgh in the mid 2010s. And I remember telling him about it, and he was like, oh yeah, we tried something like that back in the late 90s around, all of these things are cyclical. And what I often say is that a lot of the type of learning that we think about in terms of learning that makes us most human is actually really ancestral. And I think about Audre Lorde and in Poetry is Not a Luxury, where she says, there are no new ideas. There are just ideas waiting in the wings to become known, or something like that. I'm butchering the exact quote. Of course, she does it much better than I do. But I really ascribe to this idea that everything is cyclical, right? And we're building on wisdom from many, many generations and finding new ideas, new ways to express those ideas. And when I came into education, I started teaching as a Teach for America teacher in 2010. So it was a couple years after the iPhone came out. And it was abundant and clear to me, as someone who cared deeply about education and educational access, and who also was really kind of a nerd for emerging technology, that the pedagogy that I was teaching wasn't matching what young people needed in that moment. Even my first and second graders were on tablets, were really interested in the smartboard as early as 2010, 2011. And so I got into this, I didn't know what to do with it yet, but I felt this really deep tension between what I thought how fast I knew technology was moving and what I thought it could do for the education sphere, and then where I thought education was in that moment, even a couple years after the iPhone came out. And so that kind of started my journey to search for what felt like a type of learning that could both honor the ways that our brain works in terms of how we learn, and also find new ways to be able to help our brains learn by using emerging tools and technologies. And so I agree that even AI, I think, is not going to replace deep human teaching and learning. And the interesting thing about Teach for America is, for those of you who maybe know Teach for America but know it kind of tangentially, you might say, oh, Teach for America, that's an organization that, puts recent grads in classrooms for 2 years to teach. And it's true that our core program has changed a lot over the years, but it's still kind of the bread and butter of what Teach for America does. But what I want to do is also help everyone who's listening to this think about actually Teach for America as really obsessed with the problem of how do you get high quality educational talent in the places that need it most. And when I think about the definition of high quality educational talent, that definition changes over time and should evolve as the tools, technologies, ways of thinking, the ways our brain works, right, evolve over time as well. And so that's what we really do with the Reinvention Lab. We think about what's the intersection of the future of learning and the way that we as humankind are evolving in relationship to technology, and what's the intersection of that with high quality educational talent in a way that helps us think about the relationship between the talent that we believe will always be necessary to help young people thrive, and the ways that technology as a tool can supplement and augment that in the most efficient and best and ethical ways. But this idea of like product all the time sometimes will frustrate me, especially coming from a place that's so focused on talent and has seen over now 35 years of Teach for America's existence how important talent is at all levels of the education field to be able to really evolve and change, how we practice education in this country.
Yeah, one of the things I'll ask somebody if we get to a conversation about like, well, what is the role of AI in advancing teaching and learning? And I just say, well, if you were to go to your district and I were to pick two classrooms, or maybe someone else's district, because they go to a random district in the U.S. and we have two classrooms in that district, both English language arts. And the only data point I give you is one classroom, every student is using their laptops regularly throughout the week, and in the other classroom, they're not. You feel like you would know enough to even be able to guess which classroom, which teacher is being more effective. And at least so far, I'm curious for your take on that, but so far the answer has been, oh no, like that would always be, that would be useless. Like it actually would go all over the place. Like some teachers that are unplugged are actually the most engaged and are really thinking creatively about bringing students in through project-based learning. Some teachers that are using laptops as just like a multiple choice exam machine. And there's obviously lots of alternative examples, right, in the other direction. But yeah, how would you answer that? Just out of curiosity.
I mean, I will say
And it's a game show. So, there is a winnings on the line.
The Family Feud survey said, I mean, I think the basic answer to that question is yes, but very hard to tell. I think one thing that I have been thinking a lot about, though, is the underlying baseline necessity of digital infrastructure for any of this. So I've been thinking a lot about this whole conversation about, I see on the table, the anxious generation. And I've been thinking a lot about his push to ban cell phones in schools.
Jonathan Haidt.
Yeah. And, that's one of the major kind of points of his plan. And I think a lot about, well, I can't tell the difference between if there's a human in the room or if there's technology in the room. But one thing I know for sure is that if those two classrooms don't have the same access to that technology or to the internet, then I can start to talk about predicting outcomes, right? Something we often talk about at the Reinvention Lab is the type of deep learning, the type of rich, human-centered learning that works with our brains and also works in a time of rapid increasing technology should not be come across just by luck or luxury, right? And so I can't tell in that scenario, but what it makes me think is when I hear this conversation about banning phones, I think of all the potential positives of that, but I think about also how in some classrooms, in some places in America today, phones are the access to the internet and the access point to technology that will then prepare them for a technology-driven future. And so as long as the access is the same, I can't tell. But we also have to have a conversation about access, which is kind of the unsexy thing, but is also kind of part of this conversation.
Yeah, and it's especially relevant when you think about, I was looking at I've been looking for analogs, and one of the analogs that, everybody talks about the calculator. I worry that it's too narrow to draw lots of conclusions from it. But I think maybe more apt is the computer and the keyboard. And so if you look at, what school was like before, basically the 1980s and before, students are writing about half a page of long form prose on average per week. You get to the 2010s and it's 3 to 5 pages. And I don't know that people say what school is getting harder. It's just, that technology is enabling, more outputs in service of learning. And it is really troubling to imagine if you're that kid that doesn't have access to a computer and is now having to handwrite, those 3 to 5 pages and doesn't have spell checker, doesn't have access to, the World Wide Web, for better or worse. You start to get, and then of course the analog comes to AI, where there's this whole question of do we ban it, do we not ban it? And there's this presumption that if it's not banned, if AI is allowed, then all the students have access to not just AI, but the same model, because there's enough divergence in terms of the quality of the models that you actually could imagine some kids having an advantage just because they have, they're paying for GPT Pro $200 a month. And so but that brings me to this sort of deep respect for teachers who have been concerned about students using ChatGPT. I don't think it's because they're Luddites. I don't think it's just because they're not with the times. I think they're sensing the power of this technology. They don't understand it. And if there's something that has the potential for, potentially and maybe even probably harming learning, if you don't adapt to the reality of that technology. I think there's actually a lot of risks of just sort of just having sort of almost a free-for-all. Does that make sense?
It does, and
without putting you on the spot for your opinion about whether ChatGPT is cheating, feel free to
Well, I've been thinking a lot about our conversation. A couple things. One, I've been thinking a lot about our conversation we had a couple months ago where you were pushing me on shortcuts and how teachers are reasonably concerned that it's not just about cheating, but around intellectual and cognitive shortcuts, and whether or not we should how heightened our concern should be around taking a shortcut to writing that 3-page prose paper and just writing it with ChatGPT and editing it. And what are we losing in that scenario? And we can run this in the show notes, but I also recently listened to an hour talk that Alex told me I should listen to, and he was right. So if he ever tells you to listen to a talk, you should listen to it.
Yeah, David Autor.
And what I thought the airplane example was fascinating. And on the shorthand, it was that, there was a scenario where, correct me if I'm wrong, airplanes were crashing because pilots were so reliant on autopilot that they didn't know how to fly in high altitude. They just didn't have the practice. And obviously there's so many correlations there with possibilities for education, and having to have the discernment, again, as having the human judgment and discernment to say, hey, what things are we okay to take shortcuts on? Like, what things are not going to be as necessary in the future? Maybe we can take shortcuts here, but actually these things are fundamental skills that we have to learn. That's a whole, because we build the technology, we build in the judgment. And I think one thing that makes me think is, how do we bring more, again, human talent, right? Educators to the table to be building that judgment into the models, but also building judgment into future curricula that is going to be a part of this AI world. The other thing is that I don't remember who said this, and so I might be getting the statistic wrong. So I don't mean to peddle fake statistics on your podcast, but it was some larger percentage than I had expected that I heard that are, maybe you know the statistic, but teachers who are using AI to grade papers, like that has, the percentage that I heard, it was something like 20%, maybe. It was high enough where I was kind of shocked by it, because again, human judgment is so important in the analysis of student work. I've always been worried about that stop point, because there is so much. I mean, we think about something like writing, or we think about something even like art, things that are just human and subjective. The idea that we could run some of these things through AI and make our grading process more efficient without losing some sort of deep human-to-human cognitive assessment of some of our more like fundamental human skills, that concerns me. And so I'm trying to kind of calibrate, even for myself, like, okay, what are places where we can take shortcuts? And for me, at least right now, although my opinions are known to change, assessment is an area that I'm generally cautious.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a previous guest was basically said something to the effect of, one of the skills that students need to build is they basically need to be their own CIO and their own chief information officer.
That's right.
And the role of a CIO is really making decisions about what tools and technology an organization uses. And circling back to sort of the point that you made earlier about, well, maybe you wouldn't know which teacher is more effective based on just knowing whether they're using laptops or not. But you would be able to say that if it's the case that the students are in the classroom where they're not getting access to laptops, if that's actually consistent across their learning experience, even if they're building really good competencies in ELA, they are missing something important that they're going to need, which is the ability to, use technology and also encounter all the weirdnesses that come from having access to the internet, which is very much for better and worse. There's so many threads I want to pull. The one thing that I also found very interesting, which is all about the shortcuts. The example that David Autor gave about the folks flying the plane, it's related to a separate story he told about, or just an example he gave about expertise. And you have like a crosswalk coordinator who's making sure kids are not getting run over, like very important, huge societal value. And then you have an air traffic controller, and an air traffic controller makes, I think, something like 3x what a crosswalk coordinator makes. And the question is, well, why? Because they're both really valuable things for society. But the air traffic controller requires more expertise. And so right now our labor market is set up such that you are commanding value for expertise. And so when we think about career pathways, it's all about how do you build the requisite set of expertise to command that value. The scary thing about AI to me is expertise. Being an expert in using AI, I think, is going to be it's going to be like saying I'm an expert in using my phone. no doubt there will be people who are super users, and I see friends who post stuff on Instagram, and I'm like, how did you create all the but I don't think that they're listing mobile phone use on their resume, and it's probably not something that an employer would really care about. I worry that using AI is going to be one of those things where absolutely necessary. It's a skill that if you don't have it, you are going to run into problems. But you need something else on top of that. And for me, the good news is it's not necessarily new stuff. It's actually, we still need people who can read and think critically. Peter Galt at Cool.org, he says something that was really, I keep thinking about this a lot. It's like writing is thinking. The point about writing is not that you're learning how to put words into paragraphs. And it's like, the process of learning how to write is a process of learning how to actually think and how to take what's in your head and structure it and communicate it. Prompt engineering may be computational thinking skills. I don't think it's thinking. I think being a good writer makes you a really effective prompt engineer. But it's I think what you're getting at is it's not necessarily proven in the other direction. There's maybe some assumptions that, kids just need to be sort of these sort of super AI augmented workers. But yeah, just that's sort of an idle reflection without a question at the end of it.
I mean, the thing that I both thought that crossing guard and air traffic controller, part of the point that he makes is it is a specialized set of expertise that is also augmented by technology. That because the air traffic controller has to have a particular set of advanced skills in technology, that expertise becomes more valuable in the marketplace. And that example was a little hard for me because I think there's so many incredibly valuable human-to-human skills that it's going to be a lot harder for AI to replicate, i.e. elder care, teaching. That is not valued necessarily in the market in the degree that I think it should be. Let the record state, Santa thinks teachers should be paid a lot more money.
Hear, hear.
And so I'm trying to wrap my head around that too. I mean, another thing that I thought was interesting was this conversation about how, is AI going to replace teachers, right? And obviously my answer to that is no. And part of the great example, I know I'm talking a lot about this talk, but it was kind of a great talk. But I think it's worth also saying, I think the medical sphere is a really great example where you have a lot of technology. You also just need a lot of high quality humans. I mean, personally, I don't want to go into a hospital and have a computer judge me and, rely on it for my diagnosis and treatment. It would be great to have a human in that process. 10 years from now, I might listen back on this podcast and think that was silly. But I'm pretty sure I'm still going to want some human judgment in my process of diagnosis and treatment at a hospital. I mean, for me, but certainly for my kid. And so it just got me thinking about what does teaching and learning look like that is a type of teaching and learning that is a higher form of expertise because teachers are trained to be able to implement the highest, most complex versions of technological expertise to do their job, because it is one of the most important jobs that our society has. And so it deserves the highest quality technology, just like healthcare does. And that, I feel like, is something that would be really cool, pairing the talent with the tech. This is also part of the conversation last week about, it's almost like it was so, you said 95% of the conversations, it was something like that was so geared towards the tech. It's almost like having a conversation about hospitals, just about the technology in hospitals, which I'm sure happens, without ever talking about the doctors and the nurses and the, everyone in that system who makes that whole thing tick. And so I would love for the conversation to be more about how do we make sure that every single educator in America has the best technology at their disposal and the best understanding of how to use that technology at their disposal to be able to build human and durable skills for young folks. And then how do we make sure that young people in college, young people in high school are seeing that their education is technology enhanced and creative and interesting and all of those things, and then want to be educators, right? Because they see that. They're not just sitting bored, feeling like school's irrelevant. I'm not interested in being here. I can't even have my phone, which I know is super relevant to the workplace and all these places. Why would I want to go be a teacher and be stuck in this situation for a very long time? And so without having that conversation about the talent, we also risk future talent into the education ecosystem, which I think is a threat, but also an opportunity if we get ahead of it enough. I don't know if that was an answer to a question.
No, this is but this does lead us this is why I like this format, is we can kind of meander a little bit, and as long as you have someone that's really smart, my goal is just to sort of like draw out the insights that might not necessarily be something that we would hit if I sent you a list of 10 questions. And we've had guests that are like, insist, I need to know the 10 questions so I can prep. And I'm like, I'll send you them, but like, I promise you, like, we're really going to just sort of feel it out. But I have actually not heard this argument, maybe put as cogently as you put it, in terms of like the why we need to be pushing schools to be able to like safely and effectively and to implement AI. In Silicon Valley, the language, especially early on, there was like some mistakes made by some companies. And the language was, AI is going to replace teachers and it's going to help us like bridge the gap and serve all these students. But sort of implicit in that is like, well, we're not going to need teachers because the AI is going to be able to like do such a better job. And it's a very Silicon Valley way of thinking. And it really hit people the wrong way. And then there's, I think people have adapted it. And so the new flavor of that is AI is going to save teachers time. It's going to make them more efficient. And, and I've talked to unions. I've talked to, district leaders that have gone through layoffs. And this is extremely present right now. Like the conversation about AI is, sure, it could be cool for teaching and learning. They're really thinking about the impacts on their workforce, on their relationship with not just unions, but, the teachers, like, they are seeing and hearing what's, like you are basically buying into all of the conversation about AI when you implement it. You don't have control over what people are talking about, outside of your building. And I don't know that teachers are energized by it save me time. I think it's like, it's a misunderstanding of what actually matters. Like the teachers that I talk to, their goal is, I want to be able to do a better job teaching my kids. I want to do a better job engaging them. I feel like kids are not, I know that they don't think their learning is meaningful. DC public schools, I believe, is like dealing with a 40% absenteeism rate.
Yeah.
So that's what teachers are really energized by. And sure, there's like a logical flow of like, well, if you have more time, then you can focus on those things. But it's folks who are not necessarily like deep in the education space that have a very sort of like market-driven view of like, this is the problem that we need to help to solve, and then we scale it. But the other thing is like, I don't know if you saw, I forget which survey it was, but it was something like, I think it was 18%. We'll have to put it in the show notes. Maybe it was 28. I think it was 18%. Only 18% of teachers would recommend profession today. Yeah. Down from, I think, 60% not too long ago.
That's right.
And, AI might be a shiny object, and there's a lot of like risk to getting too focused on it, but it is exciting. It is an opportunity for people to build new skills and to feel relevant and to get to just be a part of this future, this moment, this like, once in a generation, if you're lucky, you get to be a part of a technology revolution. You put it very interestingly. Like, is this actually a way for us to enlist teachers, not just as something that we give to them and use them as sort of pawns in sort of the implementation strategy, but actually sort of draw them in and help them sort of tell us, like, what does this look like? How do you want to use it? That's what we do. I mean, as the Reinvention Lab, like, how have you started to figure this out? I mean, have you had any cohorts of teachers that are explicitly empowered to use AI? Like, any stories you can share about that?
Oh man, I wish I had a little. See, this is my one mistake I made, is I didn't bring a little notepad to take notes on what you said, because there's so many interesting things in that thread. So a couple things. I agree with you that the assumption of we will save teachers time, and therefore teachers will use that time for more creative, project-based, whatever, 21st century learning is an assumption I have yet to see validated in the real world in a way that it probably is happening in pockets. But I go back to my experience as a teacher, where I had the exact same assumption when I was a young teacher. I was so interested in technology. Let's be clear. personalized learning and using machine learning for personalized instruction is not a new phenomenon, like shout out Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. We've been talking about these things for a very long time. And so what is true is that, I think, is that often what happens is, one, the space that would be taken up by more creative learning is actually taken up by building the new sets of expertise to understand new technologies and be able to deploy them effectively. And then with the pace of technology and how fast it's moving, that's almost like a never-ending new building of expertise you have to build. And either you don't build it and then you don't get the productivity gains or whatever, the growth gains, or you do build it and then it's a constant process of building it. It's almost like that time that you would spend goes back into learning and relearning and being curious and being interested in what the next thing is, because you're so obsessed with your young folks growing at the highest rate that they can, that continues to be a place of curiosity and a place of learning for you as an educator and as a professional, right? And so that's like an interesting conversation of, will we over the next few years validate or invalidate this hypothesis that saving time, that A, we can save teachers time in this way, and B, that if we do save teachers time, it's going to lead to X, Y, Z or another thing. I hear that said a lot, and I'm just not sure that we have the data yet on that. The other thing I will say is that in terms of, teachers are incredibly resourceful and scrappy, and what they don't often have is the ability to weed through the noise. So you asked what Teach for America is doing. And the reality is, we had the great privilege of being at a conference last week where we probably learned about some new AI tools. And between the two of us, we maybe have our arms around some small percentage of all the AI tools that are available to education. I remember walking around the Expo Center at the AI show and being like, okay, I've heard of some of these, and it's literally my job to know about what these things are. And if I'm imagining then being a teacher responsible for any number of young people's lives, I definitely don't have the time or opportunity to be exploring all of these different AI tools, then being able to have the expertise skill of choosing, okay, which AI tool do I use, and then possibly wasting your time on a tool that doesn't work well, and then that's burns you, or possibly you use it really well for the freemium version and then you have to pay to access, and either you have to pay out of your pocket or your district has to pay and they're not paying for the procurement license. And so you run into all of these different kind of issue pockets for teachers. And so one of the things that we try to do at Teach for America, actually, this isn't something out of the lab, but I think it's a really interesting early pilot, is work with 3rd and 4th year educators who are Teach for America alumni. So creative, interesting teachers who are interested in emerging technology, and have them paired with edtech companies, both to be able to test those, high promise AI tools, but also to give direct feedback to developers. And again, this is a beautiful combination of tech and talent, right? We have really high quality talent at Teach for America that's doing incredible work in education, still in classrooms. And we have really great connections to ed tech companies, many of which are led by Teach for America alums too. And so that connection becomes really beautiful and can lead to some really interesting things. Other things we're doing is, we're training our alumni network. We're going really deep in regions to work with regional networks around training around AI. We're training all of our incoming core members around, baseline, how do we use AI effectively and efficiently and build customized tools that are really specific to what we're doing in our classroom, which is different place to place. Shout out Playlab AI.
Playlab, I was going to say,
right.
That sounds like Playlab.
So Playlab is an incredible, shout out Yusuf, shout out the Playlab team, an incredible tool that actually spun out of the Reinvention lab. So Yusuf was an official teammate of mine for a couple of years, and now we're just very close partners. And what I love about Playlab is that it's really nonprofit. The aspiration is to be AI infrastructure for a place like schools and education. And so that's really how we're trying to use it with our core members, our alumni. And we're even doing AI workshops on college campuses. We're in, I think, over 100 college campuses across the country. And part of what we want to say
Teachers or actually college students?
college students. Some of them are pre-service teachers. Some of them are just college students. And we are trying to say to them, listen, it's something like 66, I think it was a Forbes article in November 2024 that said 66% of employers, will not hire an entry-level person without an AI skill set. That is probably actually a lowball number. And so could we say to college students, this is something that we're actively trying to test and validate, like, hey, come be a teacher. Because when you're a teacher, you gain incredible skills in an emerging technology that will put you on a path to economic mobility for yourself, that will give you these really valuable industry skills. And most young people didn't see, if you're a senior in college, you definitely did not see that in high school because the technology wasn't even there, right? Which is kind of incredible to think about. So we're just testing this hypothesis of like, how do we both really work to change how teachers experience teaching and the combination of teaching with emerging technologies? And then how do we really talk about that and share the wisdom and go back to college students and say, actually, this is a really creative and interesting profession that will give you these skills, and try and change the collective mindset about what education is and what it means to be an educator? Because really, in the best of cases, it is an incredibly invigorating, energizing, creative, interesting profession. And again, one of the most important that we have.
Yeah, I'm obsessed with this. It's such an interesting theory of change for this moment of how do we rapidly evolve education? Well, we believe you have to invest in teacher capacity, build like the human capital, and that's why we do like the teacher PD and the trainings and all that stuff. But actually going a little further up the pipeline and thinking about how do you actually change the demand side, and it drives me crazy. Like my parents are both educators, and I talk to friends who are from Japan or from Norway or Denmark, and in those countries, you like try to become a teacher, and if you fail, it's like, okay, I guess I'll go to medical school. Like it is so respected. And the pay is good, but it's not even necessarily just about the pay. It's like society has imparted this prestige. And so there's that. And that's something that we are woefully in, like honestly, the opposite side of where teachers are now almost political pawns. And it's really sad. My mom works, she's 1 year away from retirement, and she works probably 60 hours a week. It's wild. And there's not, in Silicon Valley, you're like, oh, I work 60 hours a week. It's like hustle. I'm going to I'm getting my equity grants, and teachers don't get equity grants. You get a decent pension, but, and it's actually really good. And like, I think there's a lot of, a very strong case to be made for education. Society is not making that case. And TFA seems really well placed to be a voice in that, because you have so much access to not just pre-service teachers and new teachers, but you're actually bringing in folks that didn't necessarily go to college thinking they wanted to do education. So you actually, maybe you're the organization that's figured out how do we sort of pitch education as, if not a vocation, at least as a really impactful part of your journey. And so what I'm hearing from you is there probably has to be a role for AI there, because it's going to be seen as the thing that's, sexy and cool. And the other thing, if I was going to try to like help, how would we make the case? If you're in college and you're listening and you're wondering, well, maybe should I go into education? I think the answer is also yes. One of the heuristics that I use if someone says, oh, is my job at risk for AI? Well, the answer, and David Autor, I think, one of the reasons I share that with you is because he doesn't answer that question. He he literally will punt it and says, well, we don't know. And that's probably the only right answer. If someone is too sure-minded about what the jobs of the future are, you might want to ignore them. We don't know what the jobs of the future are. I think a rough heuristic, though, is open up your calendar, and how many meetings do you have? Or put differently, how much time out of your 8 hours a day are you interacting with other people, and how much of that is you sitting in front of a computer doing stuff? And it doesn't matter what the stuff is, whether it's coding or writing or analyzing or designing. If you're sitting in front of your computer, like, that's a problem, because whatever the thing is that you're doing in front of your computer, those are the types of things that AI is like, that's the low-hanging fruit in knowledge work. And so you think about like, what is it like to be a teacher? I mean, teachers technically have calendars, but they're like, every single minute of my day is, it's either, and there are components of like, grading. And so it's not every single minute, but they're spending probably 8 hours a day in front of people interacting with kids. Very complicated interpersonal dynamics of like kids and parents and administration and school boards. I actually cannot imagine a better place to cut your teeth in becoming an expert in navigating the thing that AI will probably struggle the most with. And even if AI is good at like grief counseling, I was just talking to a friend of mine who's a therapist. This is the woman in the Redwoods. She does grief counseling and people who've like lost a child, and she's been thinking a lot about AI, and but there are places, there are going to be a lot of things, and teaching is probably one of them, where even if the person is less good than the AI, like there's something meaningful about having someone that actually cares. So what is the work that needs to be done? Because the Reinvention Lab is small but mighty. I mean, I think the impact you've had is incredible when you think about Play Lab, and I think you can also take credit for the Rhythm Project in the sense of Reinvention Lab is sort of this like incubator of talent that is now going out. And so Play Lab, that's Yusuf Ahmed and his team. They were founded like 2 years ago in the Reinvention Lab. It was I remember meeting him and you when you were both at the Reinvention Lab. It was very recent.
Maybe 2.5 years ago now. It's pretty recent. Yeah.
And Play Lab is really, I would say, one of the leading, if not the leading nonprofit building accessible tools for teachers without profit motive. And then Michelle Culver storms out of the gates with this big idea of the Rhythm Project and how do we address the social emotional dimension of like human thriving, and especially how do we have those conversations with young people? Nobody. There is no other organization in the country that is like thinking about that.
Shout out to my friends and colleagues. I love them both very much.
But what is next? I mean, there's obviously lots to learn, but you've also been like pretty hands-on for longer than most organizations in the space.
The Reinvention Lab is Teach for America's future of learning R&D engine. What does that mean? We do kind of early, I call it little R, design research, ethnographic research. We work very deeply with teachers, young folks, to try and deeply understand some of the larger kind of narratives and things that are going on in the ecosystem, including but not limited to AI. And then we develop offerings that could be helpful against that set of real, challenges that students, teachers are facing in the ecosystem. And you mentioned chronic absenteeism earlier, and I have to shout out another colleague of mine who's one of the original OGs of the Reinvention Lab, Colleen Keating-Crawford. And she did design sprints with, I think, over 150 teachers and young people over the course of August to February. And she basically was able to plot young folks on a scale of, there's a scale of, are young people in school or are they not in school? When we talk about chronic, I promise I'm coming around to the point of answering your question. Are people in school or are they not in school? That's usually what we talk about when we talk about chronic absenteeism and the numbers. She kind of put a y-axis on that, which is, do young people want to be in school and do they not want to be in school? And so then you get some interesting quadrants, right? One quadrant is they're in school and they want to be there. We talk to young folks who are in school and want to be there. They are engaged. That's great. There's another group of people who are not in school, but they want to be there. We call those systemically blocked. And often when you look at the chronic absenteeism research, there's a lot of young people that fit into that category, right? They have to work, they have to take care of young siblings, they need transportation. We talk to young folks who were really benefiting from things like washers and dryers in schools, things like that. And so you see a lot of that systemically blocked work happening in the space. When you go into the lower quadrants, we're really interested in those quadrants, right? Because it's young people who don't want to be in school and who are not there. So any number of, deans of students going out to making house calls and trying to pull young people back into school might not really make a difference if the young folks don't want to be there anyway, are going to find ways to get out of it. And then there's another group of young folks who are there, but they don't want to be there. And those are young folks who, what we're finding is that the line is moving up, right? There are a lot more young folks that don't want to be in school increasingly. As we look at, we were talking before recording started about attentional power and the rise of things like TikTok and different types of new media. As we look at the rise of artificial intelligence, what we're finding is that young people just feel so much more and more urgently disaffected by the way that they're being taught. And what I often say is, when I got into this work, I felt a tension between the reality of the world and the inertia of the classroom, right? Like there's just so much inertia in the education field to keep the system the way it is for various reasons. And I felt that pressure between the exponential rate of change and the inertia of the education system. And I feel that year over year, because things are moving exponentially, that young people, educators, more folks are feeling that pressure to a greater degree year over year over year. And that's why that line is increasing. And so when you talked about the intersection of teaching and learning with chronic absenteeism, what we found in our research is that's absolutely true. And you also talked about how teachers really, they care about the tools and technology to the extent that they care that young people are growing. So what we learned is that, teachers, like, do they care that a young person is in or out of school? Yes, to the extent that they think that being in school means that a young person is learning and growing, and they care about that growth. Young people are saying, well, I want to grow too, and being in school does not help me grow. And so you have a similar interest, but a different position between teachers in schools and students who think, where's the right place for growth to happen? And so what I'm hoping is that we, as this tension grows between how do we grow students and what is the most appropriate way to grow students, and that tension comes in direct conflict with an education system that was built, 150 years ago and was never actually built to prioritize deep human learning, durable skills, 21st century skills, deeper learning, human-centered learning, whatever you want to call it. Maybe I'm wildly optimistic. That's a character flaw of mine, but I feel that tension growing, and I feel like it's gonna get to a head, right? You talk to progressive educators, folks who've been doing learner-centered education for 50 years, and those folks exist. And, we've seen schools pop up and collapse, and it hasn't been the right moment. It just feels like the right moment for learner-centered education, 21st century education, durable skills is coming because this pressure is building so intensely in a way that feels like to your very original point, we have to work together as an ecosystem to figure out, okay, what do we build now, right? If this system is kind of collapsing under the weight of all of these different pressures coming in, and actually what we all want is for students to grow, young folks to learn, how do we have the radical imagination to dream into a new way of being that actually meets that need? And if the pressure isn't high enough now, another thing we were talking about off camera is that pressure when you put agentic AI and artificial general intelligence into the mix is going to I think it's going to add so many more degrees of pressure to a system that is already feeling a ton of pressure from all directions.
Yeah, that's there is the risk that AI is the shiny object that distracts us from the work we need to do. And I think that looks something like schools rushing to implement tools just because that's the box they want to check. Implementing tools is probably important, but just implementing tools is, again, not enough. But I think it's meaningful that there has been this reinvigoration of conversation about 21st century skills and durable skills. And people are now talking about school transformation without, the education philanthropy space. I just learned this year. I should know this as someone who spends a lot of too much time fundraising. I wish I spent less. Maybe we can get some cool sponsors. Spindrift, by the way. I've been, dutifully drinking my Spindrift at every episode. Eventually, maybe they'll be our marquee sponsor.
Who knows someone at Spindrift Philanthropy who's listening right now?
The Spindrift Foundation.
Yeah, please drop the link to the email address in the show notes or the comments.
The philanthropy space. I didn't realize this.
Yeah.
Shrinking. Specifically for education.
Yeah. Frances Masano's done some really interesting thought pieces on this.
Yes, she's hosting something, I think this week, and I'm really excited to learn a lot about sort of the funding landscape now post federal dollars. Why is the philanthropy space contracted? Well, this is I think one of the big consultancies. I won't name drop them, but one of the big education sort of like boutiques that you've heard of. They were saying that essentially there's been a lot of foundations that have been working, and just private individuals have been working on, let's say, school transformation. Systems change, whatever these long threads of work in the social impact space in K-12 have been, and they're just like exasperated. Like, not that we're not just seeing meaningful improvements, it's like we're regressing, and the NAEP scores are worse than they were before. Like, we are actually going in the wrong direction, and there's a sense of like, well, nothing is working. This is clearly not a good place for us to put our money. I think that AI could be that shiny object that reinvigorates. It's almost a Trojan horse, that it's the thing that's going to get all these people to show up to the ASU GSV Summit and South by Southwest, and it's going to get 21st century skills back onto talking points and back onto the menu, and get researchers to start to really think about all these questions. And I think I'm very confident that all the hard research into like, what are the skills of the future? I think we're basically going to land somewhere around durable skills. We're going to land somewhere around schools needs to be more engaging, and self-advocacy, and inquiry, and perseverance, and persistence, and creativity, communication. And so if that is the result, I'm willing to sort of just go with the like surf the wave, even though I think there's also a lot of opportunism that happens when there is that shiny object. And so I think the key is, how do schools navigate? Because you made this point about, for teachers, it's not that they aren't aware that these tools exist. They're getting probably emails every day from vendors that are shilling, this or that tool. But it takes, I mean, even for me, sometimes I struggle to, like, there was like one company that I saw, and I was like, wow, this actually makes a lot of sense. Like, this feels like a legitimate like use case. I can see the safety component that they've addressed. And I talked with like one of the top 5 districts in the country, the person that was leading their like Gen AI work, and that person was like, oh yeah, we actually like looked under the hood, and there's a lot of issues. Basically, they're not thinking about safety effectively. They're not really thinking about algorithmic bias, and so I realized, like, even for me, I like my spidey senses are insufficient. So this is like sort of like back to this like idea of, well, what does this future world look like, where we are effectively harnessing technology to both reinvigorate the teaching profession, but also to, imbue students with the, I don't know, is it knowledge, skills, also just like the mentality? I mean, like, lifelong learning, is that a skill? How do we talk about this orientation towards curiosity?
I actually have 2 very concrete examples I can share, one small, one larger. One thing I'll say is, so at ASU GSV, the session that we led in the glass classroom was called From Reinforce to Reinvent, meaning, how do we not just use AI to reinforce the current system as it exists, create faster lesson plans, but actually use it to build more human skills? And so what we did was basically build a tool on PlayLab in which it prompted folks to leave the conference space we were in. It was called the glass classroom, and gave them an 8-minute challenge to build a durable skill. So they chose a durable skill they wanted to build, and then it gave them kind of an 8-minute challenge on how they might do that using the space, the literal conference town square that we were in at GSV, and also using strangers, right? Getting them out of their comfort zone and interacting with other people, pulling them out of meetings, interrupting people who are on their computers, stuff like that. And I will never forget a couple of my colleagues who were there, Joy Okoro and Elizabeth Booz, did, I think it was collaboration or communication or something, and they stared into each other's eyes for 60 seconds. They'd never met really before, and so they were strangers kind of staring at each other for 60 seconds. And Joy's reflections were really powerful, that it felt like a really intimate experience. I felt like this deep human connection with someone that I'd never met before. It felt really uncomfortable, and I kept looking at my clock to see, 60 seconds felt really long. And the whole presentation was 30 minutes, right? So it's not enough time to deeply explore this, but the whole idea was the session's 30 minutes. You're using 3 minutes of it to be able to get this challenge that helps you build a durable skill, and then going out and practicing that challenge. And the fact that an AI tool could get that type of deep, intimate connection in that short of a time span was kind of mind-blowing, because it's like, actually, sometimes people paint the vision of the future of AI in classrooms of basically rows of students that looks exactly like a classroom might look, with computers, and they're all doing their personalized learning by themselves, and they're on computers all day. And I think that vision is so unfortunate, because really, if you use AI at very strategic moments, you can unlock a whole realm of how to do durable skills in a really creative and interesting way, right? And so that was a 30-minute session, so it's a small example. now let's take Future Shock, which is a summer offering that we do around, it's basically how do you help young folks build the skills in interest-driven learning, in lifelong learning, in inquiry, in executive functioning, to be able to say, this is something that I really care about. Here are the steps that I can take to go try this thing out and actually just try it out for myself. And again, we have this AI tool that is called Project Launcher that we use. It's a 2-week program, right? And we use it for maybe an hour on one of those days. First, we start with community building. We start with interest building. We really help young people work with each other and work with the facilitators to figure out, like, what are my interests? What do I really care about? What am I curious about? And then you input that into the AI, and it spits out options for a project you can do within the time span, and then first steps to kind of get you started. And then it also acts kind of as a coaching tool. But what we generally find is, like, you then go from interest to, let's say there are 24 young folks in a classroom, 24 individualized projects, which for someone who's been doing project-based learning for a long time might think, like, oh my God, you generally have to go around running around like a chicken with your head cut off, trying to, like, get authentic projects with 24 young folks if you're one teacher in a room. Suddenly, AI lets you do it in an hour. And then your job is really to coach, both on how to help young people use that AI to continue to coach if they need to, but then being able to just coach on the project and help them move forward. And again, it's this really small strategic use of AI that opens up a whole world of being able to do durable skill development in a way that I think was legit kind of impossible a few years ago. If you didn't have, if you weren't able to take the time to sit with every student and coach them through a project idea. So I think there are these ways in which it's not all or nothing. It's not ban AI or use it for everything and every young person's in front of a computer all the time. It's like, how do you use it strategically as a tool? And then again, empower the human talent in the room to be facilitators and guides of that learning over time. And that requires different capacities for educators, for sure, but it doesn't eliminate educators. In fact, it makes them even more important in this type of meaningful relationship coaching mode that's going to continue to be important.
Yeah, but every story you shared and every story that I've heard, every story that we share of a teacher using AI in some amazing, creative, impactful way, there's a teacher that's like the main character of that story. Invariably, like I've literally never come across any anecdote where it's like, oh, we like brought an AI in and it sort of just like totally replaced or automated this thing that, that helped students figure out this concept that I was really struggling with. Yeah, but I think the tension is the teachers are in many cases behind their students, which is like the whole cheating thing in part is like, I've even evolved my thinking about this where it's even simpler. I think it's just, if the student is way better at using the AI than you are, they will always be able to outmaneuver you. And so the one thing you really hone in on, and this is like, we actually did something in the classroom as well. Ours was like a cheat-a-thon where we basically brought educators in, and it was like, you're gonna cheat. We're gonna give you an assignment. We want you to use AI to cheat on the assignment.
Yeah.
And
it's so cool.
It was, and you'd be surprised, like a lot of the tips and tricks that like I've seen bandied about, like the you just have students grade the AI and have them sort of like edit and like revise and provide feedback on whatever the AI puts out. And it's like, oh, that teacher just didn't realize that you could just also put the prompt into another window and just ask it to like it just. And so it's some of these things that they're not hard to figure out, but it's not a specific set of things. It also is like a moving target. The way you even prompt today is different than
100%
3 months ago.
And will be different again.
Will almost certainly be different again. I mean, you mentioned agentic AI.
Mm-hmm.
We probably don't have time to go into that whole rabbit hole. And so how
next
do you,
pod, season 2.
Yeah, season 2. Yeah, so it's like this world where the goal needs to be for teachers at a minimum to be able to keep up with students.
Yeah.
And so yeah, we're like, thinking about what does it look like at the systems level. As we kind of draw to a close, I'm curious, like, who are the other maybe surprising actors or influencers in the space that could help with sort of pushing forward a movement, really redefine and increase the prestige of teaching, and like whether or not they could directly work with the Reinvention Lab, but are there other folks that maybe aren't necessarily at the table right now that could be turnkey. And I mentioned that because you mentioned Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, and he talked about like the solution to phones and all the horrible harms that are coming from students being sort of like, glued to their phones is it's not necessarily just regulation. Like maybe regulation is a part of it. Maybe, even with cell phone bans, like that's a part of it. But he's also will admit that that's not sufficient.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
When he's pressed and they're like, well, what is a solution? The best thing he come up with is we need to create this like social norms. And like, how do you create social norms? There is no policy that creates social norms. There is no like PD session. And I'm curious, just like given that you're sort of like a little bit closer to the front lines, if there's anybody out there, maybe it's like, who do teachers really listen to? Person, organization?
My answer to this is going to feel, well, first of all, let me just say, we talked earlier about the fact that I am wildly optimistic about this moment for learner-centered education, deeper learning, whatever you want to call it. And I have to say that part of the reason why I'm optimistic is because I am sitting on the shoulders of giants who have been doing this work for a long time. I mean, shout out High School for Recording Arts, shout out Big Picture Learning, shout out, High Tech High, shout out so many folks that have really built the foundation for how we think about this type of learning that we're talking about that's going to be ever more necessary. And there have been so many difficult moments and losses in the journey of thinking about changing the system of education, and so many technology waves. Even the pandemic. I mean, folks were saying, "Oh, everything's going to change after the pandemic," and I was, also wildly optimistic in a time of deep trouble and despair. In that as well, and we didn't quite see that difference. I still feel like I hold that optimism, and part of that is because we have so many incredible people working in this field. I wouldn't say that they're necessarily not at the table, but it's still important to remember that, folks have been doing this work for decades, and you say this all the time. The second thing I'll say is I think that everything you just spoke to, Alex, is why your organization is really important and why it circles all the way back to the beginning of this conversation where we need each other in this ecosystem, right? Like Teach for America is a part of this ecosystem, but there's so many other players in the ecosystem that we have to bring together, because the reality is there are still so many teachers that are using generative AI in their personal life, but are not trained to use it in the ways that you're describing. And there's so much exciting opportunity there to bring, again, creative professionals into this new technology world. And we're going to need everyone on board with that. And so appreciate being on this podcast, and also just being a partner with you over, I can't remember, maybe a couple years now I met you. And I just always appreciate your pushes, your friendship, your ability to bring people together in this work, because I think that's really incredibly important. And the last thing I'll say, and I before this comes out of my mouth, I know it's going to sound trite, but I'm just going to say it because I think it's important. We need more young folks. And I know that's always something that people say. They're like, oh, there should be more young folks in the room. What I have learned, and again, shout out to Michelle, because she was kind of the first person to really to put this in the forefront of my mind, is like, we don't just need young folks at the table on a panel saying, here's what I think about something, right? Like, we actually need young people, not in front of us, but also not behind us, like with us at the seats of power, saying, here's how I'm experiencing this every day. Because you're right, in a lot of ways, young people are far ahead. In a lot of ways, they're also not as far ahead in thinking about some of these things, right? And it's not, there's this great kind of quote about not having young people ahead or behind, but actually just walking alongside us in this work. And it is really, really hard. I mean, it's hard from a power seat. I mean, we've had young people working on the lab team for as long as it's existed, and co-designing and really building with us. And that has fundamentally shaped the way that I think about AI, but the way I've thought about all kinds of other things that we've built in the lab over the years. And it is incredibly hard for a whole host of reasons. There's a reason why it doesn't happen all the time. And I would be both chewed out by Izzy Fitzgerald, shout out the lead of intergenerational co-creation on my team, who has worked on the lab since she was 16. She's now 20. She's amazing. If you want to know anything about intergenerational co-creation, please reach out to Izzy. But also, I wouldn't be in my values without saying that, like, young folks should be on the main stages at these conferences talking about how they're using AI. Like, it is just true, and it shouldn't be tokenized. It should not be just I'm on stage for this one presentation, but then I'm going back to my life and no one calls on me again when the lights aren't on. Like, this is sustained real work that we as education professionals, as education nonprofit professionals especially, need to build the skills, the capacity, the unlearning, the logistics, all of the things that come alongside working with young people. Because we can read all the statistics we want, but actually if we don't understand how young folks in a day-to-day practice are using this technology right alongside us, and if they don't have the power to speak to the things we're doing as a field, we do that at our own peril.
That's a mic drop. You didn't say we need Brad Pitt and...
I mean, sure, if Brad Pitt wants to hang out, I'm cool with that too.
Yeah, we have this incredible... There's 1.8 million K-12 nonprofits. Figured that out yesterday. We have 1.8 million organizations, and they're not making lots of money. Nonprofit work sucks. It's hard. It doesn't suck, but it's hard. It's not.
It doesn't suck.
It doesn't suck. It's actually amazing. But nonprofit work is not traditionally rewarding in the way that our society tends to value work. These are people that are, the reason they're doing it, and the reason they don't think it sucks, because they are passionate about like the kids in school, the teachers that they're serving. And they may not necessarily see themselves as a part of this solution. And I think that's sort of like the golden goose. It's like, how do we actually create sort of, again, build a stage for them and let them lead us? Hadn't thought about students though. That's really, really interesting, is having students walk with you and not just sort of bringing them as focus group. So as is always the case with these conversations, I actually will this has happened like 3 or 4 times now where I've left and it's resulted in actually like meetings and discussions, with my team about things that I've learned. I do feel like I learned something. I look forward to sharing and holding more space with you. I'm sure it's going to be hopefully a while. I'm trying not to travel too much.
We'll come across the bridge, coming out in Oakland.
Well, yeah, definitely. Yeah, you're local, so.
Cheers. Thank you for having me. Thank you for being part of this like community of folks who's really deeply thinking about this. And one thing that I appreciate about you, Alex, is that you have this really deep sense of intellectual flexibility. Like, you will learn from a lot of people and change your mind, not on a dime, but when you get enough data and information, you learn and you change. And I see you move differently based on how you're learning and changing in a space, and deeply learning from educators, deeply learning from technologists. And I always learn something in a conversation with you. And so I want to thank you for having me on the podcast. And I want to just thank you for being a friend and leader in the space. It's really important to have community in doing this work. So thank you.
Sunanna Chand, thanks for joining.
Thank you.